Look at this little guy. I love him. Spark the Electric Jester, a trilogy of indie platformers from the mind of Brazilian solo developer Lake Feppard, and a series that I've become a very big fan of, something that I'm sure most of you have picked up on already. Like, it may have its rough spots throughout, but I really like this series, so much so that I wanted an excuse to talk about it again in video form. But having reviewed all 3 games already, and with no Spark 4 existing, I had to branch out to something else. So hey, why not do what I've done with several other games and franchises I really like, and make a countdown about the bosses from it. Now this may seem like an obvious decision, but in actuality, it's not quite as obvious as one may think, because the series has an interesting relation with boss fights. Spark 1 has a ton of bosses, but many of them feel rather one-note. Spark 2's boss lineup isn't all too great, to be honest. And while Spark 3's boss lineup isn't bad, it still leaves a bit to be desired. Like, out of the 9 bosses in the main game, 3 of them are quite literally exactly the same, just to give an idea. That said, the trilogy does still have a fair few highlights and bosses, so here we are to, well, highlight them. No specific rules for this video, but I am gonna slap a big ol' spoiler warning on the video as a whole. I'm gonna be inevitably going into spoiler stuff, so you have been warned. With that said, let's get moving. So it shouldn't come as a surprise, but there aren't going to be many candidates on this list from Spark 2. As I noted earlier, its boss lineup isn't all too great. Between the game's overly simple combat making most fights feel kinda mindless, and the bosses themselves often not having enough to keep things interesting. Heck, some of the bosses have a bad habit of just remaining idle and letting you go to town on them. Yes, I'm looking at you, Turbo Bird. Fortunately though, there are a couple bosses in Spark 2 that do enough to keep themselves interesting, and the first of those would be the fight against Float. Now Float's a pretty interesting character when looking at the trilogy as a whole. Instead of being a GPA or android, initially, she's a 4-me cyborg, one who had been made for military use before being tossed aside and befriending Flint, and eventually joining Double's team alongside Flint. There's a fair bit of mystery surrounding her character, something that admittedly doesn't get delved into all too much in the games, but between her characterization and the backstory details we are given, she stands out amongst the side characters. Becoming playable in Spark 3 helps in that as well, but details. But prior to then, she takes on Fark under orders from Double. Now there is still some of that standard Spark 2 boss procedure in Float's fight, where you just kinda mindlessly go to town with attacks, but compared to the other bosses, Float's actually got some tricks up her sleeves. Come to think of it, she doesn't really have sleeves in Spark 2, but point is, just mindlessly attacking isn't going to get you through the fight, as Float's got some techniques that'll have you on your toes, with multiple long-range attacks that have trickier parrying timing. On top of that, once she's close to death, she transforms and starts a second phase at full health again, now with more aggressive melee attacks and a moving circle on the ground that'll do continuous damage if you end up in it. So standing still is absolutely not an option anymore. It's honestly kind of funny how adding a couple little traits like this do so much to take a boss from meh to actually pretty good. But yeah, the Float fight's a fun one. Couple that with a catchy boss theme that's interestingly exclusive to this one fight, and you've got yourself a highlight in an otherwise weak boss lineup. And to think this poor cyborg girl would end up being the key piece to the clarification. Oh, that being Clarity's assimilation takeover. That's the name that I and a bunch of other Spark fans refer to it as. I almost forgot that name for it isn't actually canon. Whoops. If I had to pick a character from the Spark series to call my favorites, that'd actually be quite difficult to do. But one character I definitely bring into the discussion in that regard is Romalo, the holographic Jester from Spark 1 and 2. Whether it be as his usual adorable self, or the more devious trickster he becomes when under the Freon virus's influence, he's a charming little fella, and I like him a lot. Make a plushie of him, Lake Feppard, I'll buy all of them. Helps that Romalo left a really good impression when he showed up in Spark 1, with the amusing fake wallet stealing scene, his follow-up scene a couple levels later, where he tricks Spark yet again with the same prank, good job Spark, and the battle that follows right after that. The fight starts off pretty simple, with Romalo throwing out various types of projectile attacks, but soon enough he starts using his holographic nanomachines to completely alter the arena to his liking via static transitions, resulting in a wide variety of backgrounds and obstacles throughout. Dodging giant fists, running from a vacuum-like pull from, whatever the heck this is, avoiding massive laser eyes. It's a very different battle dynamic compared to all the bosses you had fought before, and will end up fighting in the rest of Spark 1. And it really makes Romalo stand out amongst the game's lineup. And hey, just like Float, Romalo's fight actually has a second phase that kicks off when close to death, transforming into a giant battle mech with a lance that can both cause explosions with a poke and release shockwaves with a slash. It can be quite foreboding, especially if you're at low health by the time phase 2 kicks in, but yeah, it's a fun time. For being just a little guy, he puts up a good fight, and continues to do so later on with the fights against him near the end of the game. Sure, he's not bending reality quite like he did before, but both his regular form and his new mech form are also fun fights. But this first showdown hits a bit different with a unique gimmick. Would have been cool to see him put something like that to use again when you fight him and Astra in Spark 2, but alas. Though actually, that segues very nicely into where we're going next with the list. Because while Romalo never used the static transition gimmick for any of his later boss fights, that didn't mean the concept was guaranteed to remain stagnant. In fact, Spark 3 not only brings it back for one of its boss fights, but it's also utilized in both a creative and satisfying manner. You've worked your way through Historia Hysteria, a world that's already been quite visually trippy as is, and by the end, you're met with a boss level simply known as Throwback. Okay, this ought to be interesting. So you enter the level, and you're immediately greeted with... Uh-oh. Yep, Double from Spark 2 makes his return, who already had been getting his origins fleshed out through Spark 3's backstory cutscenes, showing just how much of a vicious killer he'd become. So right out the gate, this doesn't bode well. But yeah, you end up in a fight against Double similar to that of his fight from Spark 2. Except now with Spark 3's vastly improved combat, and Double having more in his arsenal than before, it's already quite a bit more engaging. Ah, but you're waiting for the stack transition twist to come up, aren't ya? Yep. Just like the Romalo fight in Spark 1, this fight shifts via static transitions to other forms, but in this case, it shifts into other bosses from Spark 2. Namely, it alternates between Double, EJ, and the Rhino Dino, all of which have seen improvements from their original fights. Because of that, all three of these foes are a ton more fun to fight than they were in Spark 2. And the constant shifting between Double's aggressive slashes, EJ's quick attacks and electrified AoE attack, and Rhino Dino's longer reach strikes keep you on your toes a fair amount. And it makes for a really dynamic fight. But yeah, bring each their health bars down to 0, and you've finished off a fun little trip down memory lane. Just kidding, we ain't done yet. So now you deal with Double without the eye patch, where he's even more aggressive and fast striking, including having multiple AoE attacks. Talk about an upgrade from the fight against him in Spark 2. He's far more of a force to be reckoned with this time. And all the while, one of Spark 2's superb vocal boss themes blares in the back, and yeah, this fight really is a great throwback to both the previous Spark games. Now granted, I do still wish it was revealed that Romalo was involved in this fight somehow, given the static transition gimmick was his whole thing. Heck, I would have liked to have seen Romalo in Spark 3 in general, but alas. As I noted at the start of the video, many of Spark 1's bosses felt kinda one-note, despite just how many of them there are in the game. Heck, several of them feel more like mini-bosses than full-on bosses, to be honest. Not that they're outright bad, but they do leave a lot to be desired, especially in the first half of the game. There are exceptions here and there. Romalo, of course, but also there was Metal Crow, the fight that followed a confrontational cutscene with Fark, so it being a bit more intense than the other bosses does seem fitting. But then you get to the end of Corona Forest, the exact halfway point of the game, and Lake Pepper throws a boss fight that goes way harder than it should. Because unlike Metal Crow being sent after you by Fark, Kallman's just as there as the other regular bosses in the game. But not only does he make quite the entrance, he then just, well, see for yourself. You're fighting atop an airborne log while Kallman towers over you in the background, slashing away at you with his chainsaw and taking shots at you from afar. Again, this isn't a story-relevant boss, and yet it's easily one of the most memorable moments of Spark 1's main campaign. And that's before he cuts up part of the log and leaves you on less ground than before, making the fight even more challenging while the music switches up to, in my opinion, the best of the regular boss themes in the game. I don't know why Lake Pepper decided that this boss of all bosses needed to go as crazy as it does, but man am I glad that he went through with doing so. And that's all before mentioning the version of the fight from Fark's campaign, where the cutting of the platform occurs right away, leaving you on narrower ground for the entire fight. It's a fun battle to say the least, and easily one of the biggest highlights of Spark 1's bosses. Though, now that I've mentioned Fark's campaign, So for my recent replaying of the trilogy for this video, I went ahead and played through Fark's campaign this time, now with a better understanding of how the parry system in this series works thanks to Spark 2 and 3. And while it took some getting used to, yeah, Fark's campaign is better than Spark's. Sure, Fark doesn't get Jester powers, but he makes up for it with an expanded base moveset, including much of what made the Wind Jester a necessity in Spark's story, and the incredibly satisfying parrying system. It's definitely far harder to play as Fark, but it's a lot more rewarding in my opinion. And on top of all that, Fark gets his own exclusive boss fights across the game in the form of these shadow creatures, all of which make for solid battles. Honestly, I was half tempted to just throw all the shadow bosses into one spot and call it a day. But nah, I'll actually pick one. And my favorite of them all was the final one, the Shadow Jester. For one, it's already a pretty fitting idea for how to replace the Fark boss fight in Fark's campaign. Couldn't feasibly just fight himself, so why not have him fight a spooky version of himself? And like the other Shadow bosses, the Shadow Jester puts up a great fight. In this case, wielding the power of the Super Staff all throughout to make for a pretty devastating opponent if you're not ready. Which I wasn't initially. But man, it makes for a really satisfying penultimate fight, especially if you're able to get Fark's super form active. A duel of super forms just feels really great to do, and this fight lets you do so. Couple that with the really cool animation effect on the Shadow Jester. I'm not entirely sure what Pepper did to animate the Shadow bosses, but they really stand out visually, they look so good. And, like with the previous Shadow bosses, Spark 2's excellent main boss theme plays throughout, complete with the vocals kicking in once the boss is at half health. That was probably one of my favorite parts of getting through Fark's campaign, to be honest, learning that the really cool vocal boss theme got to be used for actually really good boss fights. Though on that note, I think I'm going to stop with the Spark 2 bullying. You're still a good game, Spark 2, just not as good as 1 and 3. Sorry. So anyone who's seen my Spark 3 review, and watched the spoilery end portion, may recall that as much as I loved the game's finale, I wasn't too fond of the game's final boss, Claritas Centralis. And yeah, that's still the case. Not that it's an outright bad fight, it just felt really underwhelming, both as a fight against the overarching villain of the entire trilogy, and as a final boss, especially given how superb the finale was otherwise. Well, as it turns out, I wasn't the only one who felt Claritas Centralis was kinda lacking, as I've seen others in the Spark community express the same. And it definitely seems like Lake Feppard took those criticisms to heart, because earlier this year, he addressed this with a free update for Spark 3 that included a new special challenge, the Endless Dive. For those unaware, the Endless Dive is a multi-floored gauntlet of battles, with enemy wave combinations that'll quickly require you to master the game's combat if you want to keep progressing. These floors do not pull their punches, like, you're going to be dealing with multiple boss enemies at the same time, such as fighting 3 copies of Double all at the same time. I'm not joking. And once you get to floor 100, you're treated with something extra special. You thought Claritas Centralis was too easy? Well, say hello to... Jua Not in Control. Or as many Spark fans have come to call her, Dark Claritas. She uses a lot of the same attacks as Claritas Centralis. Melee attacks, a fair few AoE attacks, teleports, a laser barrage that'll keep you moving, tornadoes, you name it. But her AI has been made considerably more aggressive. And just by that simple change, the fight immediately goes from underwhelming to menacing. Seriously, despite having the same general capabilities as Claritas Centralis, Dark Claritas is significantly harder just from how much faster and harder she strikes, and how little breathing room you're now given. Would this have been a bit too much for the final boss fight? Maybe, but it suits her incredibly well as the floor 100 super boss for Endless Dive. And with Endless Dive having a live system, you better hope you're not almost out, or it's back up a couple floors to the nearest checkpoint. First time I went up against Dark Claritas, I had only 1 life when I got to her, and I lost it fairly quickly, so I was in a scramble when fighting her. Needless to say, I definitely got a more fulfilling Claritas fight this time around, so thank you, Lake Feppard, for including this in the Endless Dive. Relating to the previous discussion about Claritas, let's go back to talking about Spark 3's finale, because man, that was honestly pretty incredible. Utopia Shelter made for a super solid final gauntlet of a level, testing basically everything in your moveset both in platforming and in combat. The following cutscene and the bombshell drop of the fact that Clarity had already won several thousand years prior is still something that I'm shocked Lake Feppard went through. And even just Clarity's official reveal and her exchange with Spark and Fark, where she drops her meta comments on Spark's numerous repeat runs through the simulation, it's a sucker punch of a conclusion, even with the underwhelming final boss. But fortunately, Claritas Centralis wasn't the only boss fight present in this finale. And yep, this is going exactly where you think it's going. I already spoke highly about the fight against Linework in my Spark 3 review, but now having played through Fark's campaign in Spark 1, I love it even more now. Like, I already knew that the first two forms Linework takes are both direct callbacks to two of the shadow bosses, but having actually fought those shadow bosses now made returning to Linework that much stronger. It's a great throwback to Fark's alternate Spark 1 storyline, coupled with the arena being a 3D reimagining of the environment he fought the shadow bosses in. And that's on top of the fight already being super solid. With the Linework Beast having its number of aggressive melee attacks, basically requiring mastery of timing with the parry, and the Linework Reaper covering both close distance and long distance efficiently with its many different scythe attacks, some of which can't even be parried, these can both be quite tough foes to overcome. And that's all without mentioning the final phase against Linework Spark. I hadn't really thought about it before, but Linework Spark's attacks being a mix of both Spark's regular melee attacks and some of the long-range blasts that you'd be seeing from Claritas Centralis soon after, it captures the forceful fusion of Spark and Clarity here really well. And then on top of all that, the Linework boss theme is still one of my favorites across the entire trilogy, perfectly fitting the scenario and battle like the finest glove. It may not have been the final boss, but man did it help elevate the finale that much more, while tying all back to Spark 1 very nicely. Well, he was bound to show up eventually. Yep, when it comes to discussion about Spark bosses, Freom's a name that's guaranteed to be brought up, given he was the main villain for 2 of the 3 games, and given how consistently great the final battles against him have been. And to start off this high praise of the GPA Tyrant, I'ma highlight the fight against him at the end of Spark 1, an incredibly memorable conclusion to say the least. The first phase has you going up against his battle robot, and already it can prove to be a tough hurdle if unprepared for its fast strikes and notable range, especially with how much it hops around. But once Freom's fighting you head on, he quickly proves to be a formidable foe, with his fast warping, his multitude of melee attacks, and his mega laser blast. Sure, he may leave himself fairly open after certain attacks, but he can just as easily take advantage of your own movements if you're not careful. But let's be real, as solid as these first 2 phases are, it's the final phase that's remembered the most fondly. Fighting off the upgraded Freom Mark II up in space with the Super Staff in hand, Freom now armed with even more devastating attacks than before, all the while the iconic ultimate final boss blares in the background, it's easily one of the most memorable points of the entire trilogy, let alone Spark 1, and it makes for a great finale. And that's all without mentioning the version of this fight from Fark's campaign. For starters, you now fight Freom in the same creepy dimension that you fought the shadow bosses in, and it can prove to be just as much of a threat as it did in the regular story, if not more so from Fark having less health. But just as you finish off Freom Mark II, he transforms into Freom Mark III, and you get an additional phase against the now massive Freom and a whole new array of powerful attacks. All with Ultimate Final Boss once again treating your ears. This additional phase does honestly leave me preferring this version of the Freom fight, combined with preferring playing as Fark, but I'm lumping both fights at this spot since they are largely the same fight barring the additional phase. Whichever version you're taking on though, Freom makes for an incredible final boss, something that he'd go on to repeat. And yes, I am well aware of how not subtle that segue was. Yeah, Spark 2's boss lineup may be pretty weak overall, but even it knew that the Freom fight had to deliver, and my goodness, does it deliver. For one, I really like the look of Freom Mark III. It's probably my favorite of his designs. And on top of that, with the story context given from Spark 3, Freom's story in Spark 2 is honestly kind of tragic to look back on. Realizing that the love of his life had been tricking him and was targeting all life, rather than just forming life like he had believed, convincing himself that destroying the planet in its entirety to get rid of her is the best course of action. I can't say I was expecting to feel bad for Freom pre-Spark 3, but here we are now. But of course, wanting to destroy the world tends to make you a target for heroes to defeat, which brings us to Fark and Freom's son and father feud. And man does Freom put up quite the fight yet again. bringing in a lot of his tricks from Spark 1, you'll find yourself dealing with fast warps, melee strikes, full-screen AoE blasts, and a multitude of long-range attacks that basically guarantee that just standing there and mashing the attack button won't be an option. Even with Spark 2's parry system, Freeom's quite the threat, especially once he transforms and adds more attacks to his arsenal. But that's all just the first half, and the fun carries on into the second part between Super Fark and Freeom Mark Ultimate. Which I'll admit, I don't think the design's quite as strong, but eh. Now, the second half, from a gameplay standpoint, does feel a bit more in common with the usual Spark 2 boss compared to Freeom Mark 3, but even still, it's a fun fight, requiring solid use of the parry system to not get destroyed by Freeom's quick barrage of attacks. But what really amplifies this second half is both the presentation of the fight and the music. Ultimate Final Boss was already hype enough in Spark 1, but now we're given a Crush 40-esque version of it with vocals. And yeah, it does a lot for this fight. Ultimately, when looking at both halves together, the Freeom fight is super solid, and goes to show that even Spark 2 can absolutely deliver in the boss battle category. A shame that Fark destroys Freeom's core body at the end of this all, though. Would have been cool to see how a Freeom boss fight with Spark 3's combat would be like. Fortunately, Lake Feppard also thought that would be cool to see. So I'll be perfectly honest, this boss is the main reason why I decided to go with this specific topic for this video. I did want an opportunity to talk about Spark in general again in video form, but in particular, I really wanted to talk about Freeom Mark 0. For those unaware, this fight was added in the same Spark 3 update that Endless Dive was added in, serving as a secret boss that's only unlocked by beating the Dark Claritas fight on floor 100. In my case, I did know there was a secret unlockable boss when I first played the update, but I had no idea who it was gonna be. So seeing Freeom Mark 0, having been assimilated by Clarity before doing any of what he did in Spark 1 and 2, caught me by complete surprise and left me very excited. And given that this is number 1, you can bet that I was satisfied. Instead of dealing with the usual punches and kicks and laser blasts from Freeom, Mark 0 is a certified master of the blade, striking with a multitude of exceedingly fast slashes, some of which are not even able to parry, and he's equally quick in his movement, zipping around pretty frequently both to keep his distance and get up in your face when he so wishes. Couple that with the ability to spawn these energy bubbles, both as a means to keep himself protected and to coat the arena for you to avoid, and he's not an easy opponent to overcome. Quite the opposite, he wears the super boss label quite well. And that's all just for the first part. You've also got a second phase against the Claritas that restored him, pulling a lot of the same tricks that Dark Claritas had used in Endless Dive, followed by a third phase against Mark 0 again with a couple additional moves. And all these phases are separated by platforming sections across these narrow beams, coated to the brim with lasers to avoid. And to make things extra interesting, throughout the entire fight, your energy meter is constantly depleting, so don't try relying on cheesing the fight with your equipable abilities or Fark's static mode, because you're gonna get little to no chances to utilize those. And to top it all off, there's the amazing battle theme, Floating Point Error, which not only is a great song as is, but also includes a leitmotif of the depressing backstory cutscene music. This battle tests you in a multitude of ways, both in combat and platforming, and while it's definitely a massive challenge, it is oh so satisfying to partake in and complete. And it all ends off with the reveal that the Clarities are still alive despite destroying Centralis, the assimilated Freeom Mark 0 not only helping you fight off the Clarities, but that he's also not the malicious tyrant that his real-world self ended up becoming. And at the very end of it all, would you look at that, confirmation that Spark 4 is eventually happening. Probably not anytime soon, though. Lake Feppard seems preoccupied with working on XF again, which, you know what? Totally fair. But yeah, long story short, Freeom Mark 0 is my favorite boss of the Spark series, without a doubt. And that marks the end of another Ben Talks a Bunch About Spark the Electric Jester session. Knowing me, it probably won't be the last. With that said, I'll keep this ending short and simple. This has been BenjaMage, thank you all for watching, and until the next video, have a nice day everybody.